So it has become quite mainstream, and so, but at the same time, I think because it has often been, of course, meditation is not just Buddhist, of course. It is a practice that can be done within different, structures or contexts. But if the kind of meditation that has been named nowadays mindfulness was actually taken from Buddhism. And it has been presented in a way, it has been deliberately presented in a context or in a way that removes all sort of religious connotation so that it doesn't appear like you're entering a sect or a cult while you're doing it, because it wouldn't be easily accepted by the medical community or by psychologists or things like that. So sometimes I feel like it's a bit, people relate to meditation a bit like old folks with a smartphone. You know, I tend to use it for more things, but many of us use it for making calls and sending texts, and we have no clue about all the other features that a smartphone can offer. So, if you have watched YouTube videos where they explain what the button can also do, this button or that feature, you realize that there's much more on your phone that you're actually using. And with meditation, it's a bit like that too. And it's true that in the mainstream, meditation is mostly presented as, dealing with stress and being able to be more relaxed in your life, and it's like a spa for the mind, kind of. It's presented like this, and it actually works. It's not fake publicity or clickbait. It's actually true, but there's much more to it than just that. Yeah, then that also has to do with, I'm sure you're familiar with the two types of meditation within the Buddhist context. We talk about Shamatha and Vipassana. And Shamatha could be translated, and is often translated as calm abiding. So it's where you will learn to sort of calm our mind, find a little peace, detached from the frenzy of our mind, thoughts jumping here and there constantly. So it's to find a little refuge from that, kind of. But whereas in the Buddhist context of practice, Shamatha is presented a bit like a first step. It's presented as a preparation for something else. Vipassana and Shamatha are, in the Buddhist path, are practiced together, but Shamatha comes first so that we can sort of really calm our mind and be able to then go a step further. Often when meditation is presented as in mindfulness, is mainly the Shamatha practice, just, calm abiding, sort of relaxing the mind, and that's why that's where the title comes in. So beside the fact that, of course, being calm and having some sort of appeasement in our mind is something that it is very important and precious. Within the Buddhist perspective, it's a necessary step, as in the image or the example that the Buddha gave when he explained that even though the nature of water is to be clear, if the water of a river, for instance, if children have been playing, or water of a lake, if children have been playing or there has been a lot of movement, all the particles, that are at the bottom will be stirred, and then you won't be able to see through the water. It will become muddy and unclear. But then if you take a bucket of that water, for instance, and let it sit for some time, all the particles will drop at the bottom, and then the water will become clear again. So that's the example and the image, I'm sure you all know, that is given to explain what happens with our mind. When the thoughts are relentless and, agitated and all of that, our mind is very muddy, very unclear, very foggy. We can't see things clearly. So we need to let it rest. We need to let it settle down, and then once it has done that, at least a little bit, it becomes a little more clear, and then we can start investigating. So what do we need to investigate? When we see what really creates much of our suffering, we tend to always think that it's the outer phenomena, people, I would be so happy if people were like this, or if my husband was like that, or. But if we look properly with a little more insight, I would say, with, a little more carefully, we would realize that, yes, of course, many of our sufferings are related to people or to circumstances or life events or things like this, but it also depends a lot on how I interpret it, because the same thing can be a catastrophe for someone and then a minor event for somebody else. It depends how I deal with the outer events, and eventually maybe we will even discover that it's most of the sufferings we endure are actually not related with anything. It's just our own making, our own creation. If somebody tells you something unpleasant, say, for instance, in my case, oh, you put on some weight. If it's something if it's very important to me, then I will go home and replay it in my mind, The actual thing only lasted 3 seconds, 5 seconds, but I can make myself miserable for hours. And I will keep saying, this is because that person told me this. But in fact, the person themselves have nothing to do with what I do with it, If I was only suffering because of what the person told me, it would take 5 seconds. But then as I replay it in my mind, it can last for hours and sometimes, years. So years later, I will meet the person and say, you remember when you told me that? So, so if we really look properly, we might come to the conclusion that perhaps a big portion of our suffering is our making. Yes, I actually have a TikTok account. And a few years ago, I made a video of 1 minute with this exact thing, somebody tells you something unpleasant and then you go home and replay it in your mind for hours, whereas, the original problem only lasted 5 seconds. It had 235,000 views. Because people relate with this, everybody can understand this. But then the comments were, and how can I change it? Yeah, you won't be able to watch it because it's in Portuguese. I mean, you can, but you won't understand. And the comments were mainly made by Brazilians because they're more extroverted, the way Portuguese are a bit more discreet. But that's the thing, Well, Shamatha already, by, by becoming aware of the awareness, like, like when somebody tells you, like suddenly, what are you thinking? We can look at our thoughts, but we generally don't do it. So we're just thinking, and we are absorbed by our thoughts, like sucked into them, So we don't separate ourselves from our thoughts, so we can't see them from outside unless somebody asks, what are you thinking? Or if we are sitting in meditation, and that's what we are supposed to be doing, like being aware of what is happening in our mind. And that already makes a big difference. It's absolutely, because then you become aware of your thoughts, and then you start to have a little more space to work on them, to change them if need be, to try another perspective, this is what meditation gives us, space, freedom actually. Instead of just repeating the same patterns again and again, we suddenly have more space to sort of dance a little bit around our thoughts instead of being sucked into them. We say, okay, and if I look from there, okay, now it's different, That's what shamatha can give us. And it's precious. It's a bit like, instead of being in a very small place, like a lift, with a very troubled monkey, jumping all over. Now, if with shamatha that's when you get sucked into the thoughts, it's very, very narrow. You're stuck with, and the more anxious the thoughts are, the smaller the space. You feel like you're constricted. And it's very troubling to be around that very agitated monkey, which is your mind. But so when you bring shamatha into this, it suddenly opens a bigger space. Now it's the same as now you're with the same monkey, but you're in a ballroom. Okay, so now it's totally different. The monkey can jump around, but it won't disturb you as much. You can look at him, you can also do something else. You have space. Your mind is more vast than the thought. And that gives an incredible leverage, that gives an incredible freedom to not be completely manipulated by our thoughts. We have the freedom to decide otherwise. And this is by no means a small advantage. This is big already. But we're still at the stage of just using the phone for messages and calls. This is what it makes possible, mind training, for instance, because that's where you finally have some freedom to choose how you're going to respond, you're going to interpret what is happening. Because, we tend to always think this is because something, I'm suffering because this happened or that other thing happened. But we often don't realize that it's because how we interpret what happened more than the simple fact. It's how I tell the story to myself or to others, but what story do I tell from that specific event? And that's where this freedom comes so handy, because now you suddenly realize that you can also tell a different story. And depending on the story you're telling, your reaction is going to be totally different. I'm not sure I already told this story here, but anyway, I will tell it again. A few years ago, like in the beginning of the 2000 years, like almost 10, 20 years ago, I used to go to Tahiti a lot because there was a Buddhist group that invited me there. How lucky, huh? And one time we were there and we invited Rabjam Rinpoche. He is the grandson of Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche. he was coming from Nepal, and it was like April or something. And in Nepal it was still quite cold, but in Tahiti, of course, it's tropical, so it was hot. And at that time, there was a plague of some insects that the Tahitians called peeing flies.
Uh-huh.
Because they were no flies at all, it's a completely different family, but they would suck the sap of the trees and then pee. But there were so many that when you were standing under a tree, you would feel like a very thin kind of moisture coming down. You want to translate?
Yeah.
So on the first morning after his arrival, we were waiting for somebody to go to the beach. And he was standing under a tree, and he was wiping him. He was sweating, so he was kind of wiping his forehead. And I said, "Oh, Rinpoche, it's hot, isn't it?" And then he said, "Yes, but there is this, there is this moist, very refreshing."
Yeah.
And, I shouldn't have said anything, but I explained what it was. So he didn't really react on the moment. But then later on, he had a talk in the city, in a venue, and he gave this as an example. And he said, when I was thinking it was just, moist coming down, it was refreshing. But the moment I understood what it was, I completely felt disgusted. So, the interesting part is that nothing changed, really. Between the first moment and the second moment, nothing changed in reality. But everything changed because now there's a different story.
Yeah.
So you can do it both ways, of course. This happens probably most often. But if you really know how to, if the point with the mind training is to get our mind to become very flexible. So you should be able to go from from rain to pee, and from pee to rain, just in order to feel different about something. So that's where, things like considering your enemies as your teachers, for instance, that's how it comes about, Yeah. It's just learning that it all depends, the way you feel about something depends on how you look at it, your perspective. And that gives already an enormous power to change our lives. Yeah. A lot of freedom to change our perspective about things and actually become happier. It still doesn't confront the basic problem, which if we look into a little deeper into what triggers our suffering, what triggers our desire, what triggers our fear, what triggers our aversion and pride and everything, it all comes down to one thing: me. Right? So imagine that somebody gives you a box, closed. You don't know what's inside, but the person who gives the box to you says something very precious is inside that box, and you should defend it with your life. Mm-hmm. Don't let anybody take it away from you. Don't let anybody, just break it or anything. You really, whatever you do, you always have to keep it with you and very safe. And, so you do it, And we're ready to kind of die for that box, but we never open it. We have no idea what's inside. So we spend all our lives defending, improving, putting some nice brocade around, defending it with, with all we got. Maybe we get punched, or maybe we suffer different ways. And we're always defending and improving, and that box. And we never have the idea, let me look inside. Maybe actually I'm just doing this for nothing, right? We probably even lose the key to open the box, and we compare, is my box nicer than her box? In time, we completely forget that we're supposed to be defending it because there's something valuable inside. It just becomes a habit. So, we're ready to die for it. And without ever questioning, is it worthwhile, So Vipassana is, once our mind becomes a little more clear and, settled, there's now a little bit of peace. We're not just dragged around by our thoughts constantly, or at least for some moments. So we now have a little more freedom to sort of say, okay, there's this box here. Maybe I should look inside, maybe I should. Why am I doing all of this? Why do I feel hurt when somebody says, oh, my box is nicer than yours, or your box is fatter than mine? Or, why do I get annoyed? Why do I suffer for it? First of all, I should look inside the box and see that, is there anything worthwhile, all the trouble I get in because of it? So Vipassana is a little bit like our, microscope. We can see things more clearly, sort of challenge assumptions and not just take it for granted that there's something precious in that box. We actually try to open it and see what is it inside that is worth all the pains that I have had so far. And that's when we use the clarity of our mind to look into things we normally don't look into. Like, for instance, what is there in a thought? Is it solid? Is it real? Does it have a gun to my head saying, you have to do this, otherwise I'll kill you? It sounds, when you look into, for instance, Mahamudra instructions on meditation, and they ask things like, what's the color of mind, or and was it its shape, or things like this. We find it almost childish, kind of. I mean, of course, mind doesn't have a shape. Of course, it doesn't have a color. The point is to make you look, not to have an answer. There's no answer for those questions. It's just to look, actually take the time to look. Kandro Rinpoche often says that when she was a child and when she was young, her father or her teachers would actually make them really look in every corner of the, where is your mind? And they say, oh, mind has no place. But then he would say, no, you really need to look under every cushion and every chair and everywhere to see if you find the mind. When we hear this, it feels a bit almost childish, but there's a purpose in that, is to really not just agree with an assumption just because we are too lazy to check, because that's the difference between ignorance and enlightenment. So yes, when we're practicing shamatha, we always say, now you sit and as an observer, you're observing your thoughts. Don't let yourself be pulled into them. And if you realize you have been pulled and you're just, going with it and get distracted, you bring your awareness back and you sit as the observer of whatever is happening within your mind or sounds or sensations or whatever it is. With Vipassana, we then look at the observer itself. So that's a different thing. I remember once I was giving a meditation class, and then towards the end I said, okay, now you observe your thoughts, and then your sounds, and then sensations, and now look at the observer itself. And then, the class was over, and I asked around if anybody had questions or had something to say. And there was this lady who said, well, when you said to look at the observer, I looked, but there was nobody there, and I got a bit scared. She opened the box. Also within the Buddhist framework, meditation does not stand alone. It's there are three trainings normally. Ethics, so you learn how to avoid negative things, cultivate positive things. And then there's the wisdom. There's the meditation, and then there's wisdom. And, depending on the perspective you use, what level of Buddhism you're talking about, it goes this way or the other way around. So sometimes you start with ethics, meditation, and then wisdom. And then sometimes you talk about view, meditation, and action. And I personally feel more connected with the latter, because I feel like meditation is, for instance, we know what we should be doing, but we don't do it like that. So that's, knowing what we should be doing or how we should behave pertains to the view, let's say. We understand, intellectually, but it doesn't translate into our action. For that, the bridge to bridge the view with the action of the behavior is the meditation. Because meditation is where we can actually experience the view. And it's through that experience that then it translates into our actions, into the way we approach the world, into the way we experience the world, and so on and so forth. So that's why, for instance, a quantum physicist has a very sophisticated view, but if it doesn't have the meditation to bring that view into his behavior, into his life, it will not change much of the way he experiences life. So it remains two completely different, distinct things with no connection. Say, if his wife asks for divorce, I'm not sure he will see her as a collection of quantum particles. He will probably react differently, mostly like anybody, even though when he goes to his laboratory, he can talk for hours about, quantum fields and quantum particles and the fact that we don't really exist and things like that. But that's all theoretical. It doesn't translate into real life. So that's where, meditation stands in between. And it's because the philosophical view of interdependence in Buddhism is very near to the quantum physics view nowadays. But then we have this extraordinary tool, which is meditation, that allows us to experientially to experience the view, and that is what actually transforms us. So then it translates into the way we act into the world, the way we experience reality. So in the Buddhist method, these three things work together, because we have a certain view, and then we meditate on it, we internalize it. It doesn't remain just as something external or something intellectual. We have to think about it, like digest it, make it ours, let it sink, kind of, and then we act differently. Or wherever you start, the process is like a loop, you know. Once you start acting differently, then, and because you're meditating and experiencing things in a certain way, then it feeds your understanding, that in turn feeds your meditation, that in turn changes the way you react, and it goes like this, like a loop. So that's why, I mean, if we're talking about just meditation for relaxation, it's okay, that's no problem with that. But if we're talking about real change, like understanding how life works, what we are and what the world is, and how we can really get the happiness we desire, like stable, you know, not the ups and downs of life. And so if that's what we want, then we have a method. It doesn't mean that it has to be Buddhist, but I have to say, maybe I'm a bit biased, maybe. But it's the best I've found so far, you know. It's so why we don't have to go back and invent fire or again, you know. It's already been done, so now we have lighters. It's so much easier than stones. We don't have to go back. So if there is a good method that works, obviously, because there are many beings who have achieved enlightenment, and they, you know, we can see that they actually live in or experience the world in a different way. So, you know, if there is already a method, it's maybe an intelligent thing to just follow along, you know. But very important is that we have to make it ours. And the only way to do that is through study, meditation, and reflection, and all of this, and experiencing, putting it into practice, because then that, you know, sort of feeds the loop, and you keep growing every day. Yeah. However, you know, these two approaches doesn't have to be one or the other. I mean, changing the narrative doesn't necessarily challenges the idea of the I. It just changes the narrative. We're not actually looking into the nature of who is benefiting or who is going to be, who is going to have some disadvantage or anything like that. We're just changing the narrative, and changing the narrative consists in changing something that appears to be negative or appears to be against the box and changing that into something that appears to be positive, you know, like saying, for instance, as we said earlier, saying that my enemies are my teachers is a way to, you know, see something that at the starting point seems to be negative or challenging for me, and looking at it from a different perspective, seeing how actually having to deal with difficult circumstances might be good for me. But I'm not questioning the me, I'm just changing the narrative. So, but this is great. This already achieves a lot. So we don't have to say, oh, this is just that. No, this is very important, and this is very useful, and we should definitely train in that. But then go a little further, you know, and then at some point say, okay, but who is this me that is going to be benefited or is going to have trouble, or who is suffering actually? Who is this? And that sort of willingness to challenge the things that are taken as assumptions by 99.9% of human beings, and us most of the time.
Yeah.
This willingness to challenge it is what Vipassana really teaches us. You know, so that's why, you know, when we hear things like when the Buddha says you shouldn't believe anything just because everybody says or because it always has been like that, we think, oh, he was so ahead of his time. But actually, he is just telling us you should really look into the box, don't just go on all your life defending that box, even to, giving your life away because of that box without ever trying to open it and see if what's inside really worth the pain. So it's kind of tricky. It tricks us. Okay, and it takes a lot of time to actually, sometimes I think when sometimes we're meditating and we're particularly relaxed and sometimes, for a glimpse, for a nanosecond, we look at the observer and it might say, oh, he's gone. I mean, where is it? But then, everything goes back to whatever we are used to be, because it's a glimpse is just a glimpse. You don't really build a whole, it doesn't necessarily immediately translate into a very big shift and you start being somebody completely different. Because it is even said in the teachings that, the habitual tendencies, which are the subtle habits, remained for a long time. The comparison that I find it wonderful is like a bottle of perfume that is empty but still smells like the perfume that has been inside. So your box is open, kind of, it is not, there's no one there, but it still smells like So if you're in, daily life and somebody says something unpleasant, there's still this reaction that comes, even though you have experienced, perhaps for a glimpse or for a minute or whatever, that there's no one there. There was no need to be, angry or whatever, but you still are because of the habit, So it takes a long time. But it doesn't matter because, even if it takes a long time, every little step makes life easier. So, even if you can't see anything, you haven't opened the box, but you know how a little bit changed the narrative, it's already better than not knowing how to change the narrative. And if you can change the narrative like 10% of the times, it's better than none. And then if you progress a little bit more and can do it 20% of the times, it's better than before. And like this, So, it's a path, it's a method. And every little step makes things better. Well, except if it's backwards, that also happens sometimes. So ultimately, since there's absolutely nothing that can affect us that doesn't go through mind, when we work with our mind, we affect every aspect of our lives, Recently, I was on a plane from, it was at the time there were big storms in Portugal, and I was coming home. So I was going to Portugal, but we were stuck inside the plane for 1 hour and a half, waiting to have permission to land. We were at the departure airport. They wouldn't depart before having the permission to land. So, and I was sitting next to a young man. At my age now, most men are young. And we started talking. He was French, and we started talking. And I realized he was a professional ping pong player. And he travels everywhere. He has contests every weekend. And then we started talking. And he said, well, I deal quite well with most things when I'm playing, but recently I had this thing. It was a tournament and I was winning, and then suddenly there was this thought that came, and it became obsessive, and I couldn't get rid of it, and I ended up losing. So I said, meditation. And then, it was interesting because I explained a few things, and he said, okay, I will try. And So that's it, you actually, because of dealing with the mind is what it is all about, since everything we can experiment is only through the mind. So it can, having a little experience on how to deal with our mind can help in a multitude of situations, almost everything in life, relationships, difficulties, happiness, ping pong, tennis, whatever it is, pain, everything is comes through the mind. I've experienced that myself. I had to, as part of a scientific experiment on the benefits of meditation, I had a 2-hour session of MRI, and I'm slightly claustrophobic, so it was like, ugh. I had a panic button, but I didn't want to push it. One has one pride. And I was the only Portuguese in the study. There was also that. So, I realized that, I was supposed to be, there were parts where I was supposed to be meditating and parts where I was not supposed to be meditating, so they could see in my brain if there was any difference. I don't know if there was any difference, I have to say. Not on the good side, more like... But yes, I was trying to focus on the breathing, and there was nothing painful or nothing particularly discomfort or anything. It was just everything was fine when I was just focusing on the breathing. The moment there was a thought come like, oh, this is so narrow, there you go, But because I didn't want to push the panic button, I stopped myself there, and then you bring back your attention, you bring back awareness to the breathing, and everything goes fine. So you realize that the problem is not being stuck in a tube. The problem is thinking you are stuck in a tube. That's when problems start. And also, it's not the first thought that is really a problem. It's the second and the third and the fourth, and then you bring more sort of, it starts bubbling, and that's where, panic comes.
Yeah.
So, it can help with everything. If it wasn't for meditation, I wouldn't even be in that tube for a starter, I wouldn't have accepted. But I was so interested in the whole experiment. It was a whole week with, those things like, these electrodes and lots of experiments. It was very interesting. I have no idea about the results, and I don't want to know. But it was very interesting, and it was, a real life example on if we could get to that same level of awareness in daily life. Of course, that was a specific situation, and there was some things at stake, so I was particularly aware. But if we could bring that to our lives, things would be so much easier. The moment we get distracted and drawn into a whole train of thought, we just bring ourselves back to the here and now, the reality. The reality was that I was lying down with a cushion under my legs, a little blanket over my legs, and comfortably. Well, I was a bit squeezed because, but other than that, it was nothing painful or anything. So there was nothing to be afraid of, except I am stuck in a tube. And there you go, So everything becomes, meditation really, or this training of the mind, not just mind training, but, working with the mind and realizing the power it has, and also how you can make it more flexible, and, even challenging it a little bit, and all of this changes everything. It sort of irradiates in every aspect of our lives in a positive way. Yeah, so Okay, I think that's all for today. It's late and we all want goes to sleep. So thank you very much for your patience. Thank you very much for your translation. And see you, maybe some of you tomorrow. If not, thank you for coming.
Yeah.